The Exorcist franchise has had a fairly rocky history with its sequels. I consider Legion to be one of the best examples of how to make a sequel to something as iconic as The Exorcist, but the rest of the series ranges from mediocre to downright atrocious. David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy was certainly controversial, but that didn't seem to sway Blumhouse from letting him helm a new Exorcist sequel after their $400 million acquisition of the IP. Lots of pressure there to make a return. Yikes. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. So back in October, the latest entry in the Exorcist franchise released to a wall of sheer hatred, with many people going as far as to say that Believer dethroned Heretic as being the worst Exorcist sequel.
It fills me. I can do anything.
Now, I tried to give Believer the most balanced possible review I could when it first came out, and hell, I even had it above Heretic and Beginning in my ranking video and had a number of movies lower than it on my ranking from 2023, but I'd only seen the movie once at that point. I've been wanting to take a second look at it for a while now and dive deeper into the movie in a spoiler video so I can talk about all the things that I thought Believer did well and all of the other stuff. Plus, I think it'll be nice to clear the air a bit on my thoughts on this movie because I've had a number of comments that seem to have gotten the impression that I thought Believer was a great movie. That is definitely not the case, but I did try and focus as much as possible on the stuff I did like about it since since it was getting so widely panned, and at least in my opinion, not given enough credit for some of its better elements. And I've done my due diligence on this one. Of course, I gave the movie another watch, but I also went through all of the included bonus features, which I genuinely really enjoyed watching, and I was super glad to see a home media release from a big studio include so many bonus features, which seems to be getting less and less common. I may not always be on board with how David Gordon Green executes his creative ideas, but I can't help but love listening to the dude talk about filmmaking. He's got such an infectious love for the craft, even if his ideas don't always translate well. The Exorcist Believer was set up to be the first part of a trilogy, but with Green recently disconnecting from The Exorcist Deceiver, the sequel to this movie, and that one being removed from the release schedule, the future of this storyline is pretty unclear. You can bet your ass there will be more Exorcist movies coming because of how much money Blumhouse spent on the IP. They've got a long way to go before even breaking even, so we'll see what they do going forward, but for now, let's take a look at one of the most hated movies of last year and see if it really earned its reputation.
Are you looking for Reagan? Are you looking for Reagan?
For some context, what is it that made the original such a groundbreaking movie, and why has it stood the test of time? Novelty was a huge part of its success, without a doubt. Audiences had never been exposed to something so viscerally frightening before, and the movie pushed things way further than most people were comfortable with at the time. I still firmly stand by that The Exorcist has moments that are still disturbing today, but most people who see it for the first time now aren't running out of the room dizzy like people were back in 1973. We've had a lot more time and seen a lot more movies to help us acclimate to horror, which is why you'll find a lot of people now saying that The Exorcist is an underwhelming or overrated movie, which is just blasphemy to me. I went into a lot more detail about this in my review for the original Exorcist, but I think it's often a victim of its own reputation because it's referred to as one of the scariest movies of all time, but audiences now are so much more used to this kind of thing that it just doesn't have the same impact anymore. If we're talking objectively and based purely off of how scary a movie is and not how groundbreaking and inspirational it was for the genre, then I would agree in saying that The Exorcist isn't the scariest movie of all time, but I would also follow that up by saying that it's still, by far, one of the most impactful horror movies you'll find. It's also one of the greatest movies ever made, period. And that's with the context of everything that's come since. What makes The Exorcist a true, timeless masterpiece isn't the spider walk scene, it's not the head spin, and it's not the crucifix scene. This is a deeply emotional story about connection and struggles of faith with some of the most brilliant writing you'll find not just in horror, but storytelling in general. It's a story about people first, and Regan's possession is just a setup used to help explore the movie's themes. It really isn't about Regan at all. It's primarily about a single mother fighting for her daughter's life against something she has no clue how to grapple, and a priest who's lost his faith in the thing that he committed his life to. What makes it scary now is those themes of loss and fear of the unknown and uncertainty and doubt and love and the repercussions of love and sacrifice and compassion. It is an airtight masterpiece, and I mean that. I think that word is really overused, but with The Exorcist, I really think that it earns it. While I still find the scare scenes very effective and upsetting, the things that really get under my skin are the underlying themes and the revelations that come with them. I could go on and on about what makes The Exorcist one of the greatest movies of all time, and as much as I would love to do that, I already did, so go give that video a watch if you want to hear more of my thoughts on it. I wanted to set the stage for this review of The Exorcist Believer because when you have something as beautifully woven as that original, it's a questionable choice to try and follow it up, and that turns to full-on frustration when what you follow it up with is messy and generic. Which brings us now to The Exorcist Believer. Now, I'm gonna be as fair as I possibly can to this movie because despite all of the massive problems I'll be talking about, I still think that the movie has some value that got overshadowed when it released. As a franchise, The Exorcist is fucking ridiculous. We ventured into some absolutely bizarre territory with very little success, but one thing you can say for sure is that no two of these movies are alike. Beginning was essentially a remake of Dominion, and even those two movies feel wildly different, so at the very least, there's a lot of variety on offer. After seeing the indisputably bold swings David Gordon Green took with Halloween Ends, I went into this expecting that he'd want to do something different with The Exorcist, but I was a little surprised to find that Believer is by far the safest sequel. There isn't anything wildly new or unique in this movie. It's more like they're taking things from the original and putting a little twist on them, like having two possessed girls instead of one and mixing in religious practices outside of Christianity. The shining light of that original movie is its characters, so let's talk a bit about what we've got to work with in The Exorcist Believer. Leslie Odom Jr. stars in the lead role as Victor Fielding, who has to make a very difficult decision at the start of the movie when he's honeymooning with his wife in Haiti and an earthquake hits.
Your wife has serious injuries. Anything we do to keep her alive would endanger your child, your baby. It's a difficult choice. Cannot save them both.
After that Halloween trilogy, it shouldn't really come as any surprise that Green is wanting to do some thematic exploration with The Exorcist, and the idea of choice is something that seemed to be a focus. A lot of people didn't like that Green's Halloween trilogy tried exploring things like trauma, mob mentality, or villainization, or at the very least didn't like how it was executed, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it makes perfect sense because that kind of thing isn't a core pillar of the Halloween franchise, but with The Exorcist, you bet your ass you've got to do some deep thematic exploration in order for it to work. A lot of that stuff in the Halloween movies was done through very overly dramatic monologues that bordered on cheap Shakespeareanism, which I actually didn't mind because I felt like it fit the tone. The original Exorcist portrayed its themes through incredible writing, phenomenal acting, and undertones brought about by the characters' interactions. Overly dramatic monologues don't fit anywhere in The Exorcist, but it seemed like the writers here just really don't know how to convey this kind of thing without having people say it outright, because Believer has the exact same sort of the thing that the Halloween movies did, but they're way more out of place and honestly just written worse. I had a feeling this was going to be the case for this movie the moment that I saw Scott Teems was co-writing. Nothing against the dude as a person. Every time I've seen him in behind the scenes stuff, he seems like a perfectly fine man, but his writing is really not subtle at all. And while in something like Halloween Kills, it doesn't bother me, here, it's a different story. Chris McNeil is one of the worst offenders of that, and I will be talking about her character in just a moment. Before we really dive into that stuff though, I want to give the movie some praise for the first act because I think it's pretty solid with some great build-up and unsettling moments. Victor's daughter Angela and her friend Catherine go off into the woods together and aren't seen for 3 days. There is one scene that's pretty unnecessary where he goes to a nearby homeless shelter and it's just the most crude, gross people.
Maybe find something else instead.
It doesn't really add anything, it just feels like an unflattering caricature, which I was kind of surprised to see in a David Gordon Green movie. It's one of the better examples early on of the writing here just being the most shallow, by-the-numbers dreck that unfortunately plagues a lot of the possession genre. Another one would be the idea of how the girls being possessed while they were in the woods is first brought up. Catherine's mother just says it.
Something they did out there opened them up for an unholy spirit to enter.
That's how demonic possession works.
This is one of my least favorite things in possession movies, where a character just comes right out and calls it without earning that realization from the characters. In the original movie, it takes a long time before anyone even mentions the possibility of Regan being possessed, and it takes a while longer than that before it's treated as an actual demonic possession and not just a neurological problem where she's convinced that she is. This moment is so ridiculously cheap and on the nose, and while Victor doesn't believe Miranda right away, the speed at which he goes from adamant non-believer who lashes out at people who suggest seeking religious help to thinking an exorcism is the way to go has got to be a world record. He just flips on a dime when he sees a photo of Regan's skin spelling out "help me" because he saw something similar on his daughter, and what makes this even more frustrating is that his switch comes directly after a scene where he snaps back at his neighbor for suggesting that he look to God for help.
You know you religious types are all alike, you know that? Something bad happens must be the devil, something good happens must be God.
It's very jarring and feels like they had an idea in mind for this arc of someone slowly becoming a believer, but had no idea how to give the emotional and philosophical weight that should have. Want to know an example of a movie where a main character is struggling with their faith and eventually turns to God? The fucking Exorcist! This arc was already done in the original movie and with vastly better results, so it makes it especially hard to ignore here. We spend most of the movie with Victor and Angela, and while you'd think it would make sense to give both girls and their respective families equal attention considering the main thing this movie has going for it is the two possessed girls, but Catherine and her parents get next to no development at all, so the story is very one-sided on Victor's struggle and trying to help Angela. Catherine and her family could be completely cut from the story for the most part, especially once a bit of retooling is done to a plot point from the end of the movie, and it really wouldn't change much at all, which is not a good sign considering half of the faces on the fucking poster barely matter. And there are only 2 faces. That shallowness extends beyond Catherine and her family through basically the entire movie, which is why we're going to talk about Chris in just a second. Before that though, there's a lot in the first act that I actually did enjoy. I think it's quite a good looking movie with a visual style very similar to Halloween Ends, which I've always praised for being very good looking. It's got a nice brisk feel with that great deep blue lighting for the nighttime scenes, and the steady camera work gives the scenes a lot of room to breathe. It can feel pretty immersive at times, and another thing that might be a bit controversial is that I enjoyed some of the more bizarre creative decisions that were made visually, at least in a vacuum. This kind of thing doesn't fit in The Exorcist, but on its own, there's this sort of neon glow to certain moments that I really enjoyed atmospherically. There are some wild visuals, and while I really don't like the extremely heavy CGI in the climax with these portals to other dimensions, the way it all looks aesthetically feels like a pretty dope haunted house attraction. Again though, in terms of trying to achieve the grounded and realistic feel of the original movie, this is so out of place and immersion breaking. The other thing that needs to be praised from basically start to finish is the ridiculously good performances from Lydia Jouett and Olivia O'Neill. They are absolutely the highlight of Exorcist Believer and are the main reason I'm able to make it through to the end.
Honor your mother with a child in her name.
We don't get a ton of time with them before they get possessed, especially Catherine, but from the dazed confusion after they're first found to the slow descent into the explosion of evil they are in the climax, these two absolutely nailed everything that was asked of them. Even the church moment, which looked really stupid in the trailer, sort of works because of how far Olivia O'Neill pushes herself and lets loose for it. Their facial expressions in tandem with Christopher Nelson's always fantastic makeup work allows for some truly unsettling shots, and each and every line they deliver has a lot of weight to it, even if a lot of the writing isn't doing their performances any justice.
I don't want to die.
That's one thing that I really want to emphasize. This is not a good movie, but these two gave fantastic performances and should absolutely be given credit for that. On that note, Leslie Odom Jr. also does a pretty good job, and while Ann Dowd is in the movie, she unfortunately is given next to nothing worth a damn to show her usually great performances.
Fight's in there.
It's good that Lydia and Olivia had roles that just let them go crazy, because the other characters' roles are very dialogue reliant, which doesn't allow them to do much of anything considering the quality of script we've got here. Something to praise a bit here. The medical scenes after the girls are found actually got under my skin a fair bit. I was pretty uncomfortable for a lot of it, and especially those first few scenes after Angela got home and Victor is slowly realizing just how bad it is were properly unsettling, and I think it's one of the few sequences where I can feel the intentions Green set out with coming through properly. The first act just says some good shit. Nothing amazing or anything like that, but there's some value here with this slow burn buildup and creepy nods like the girls' feet being burned when they show up. That sort of vague religious imagery is great. Would have been a lot better if they didn't just point out what that could mean.
You think they went to hell, burned their feet in hell.
All right. Chris McNeil time. Ellen Burstyn, let's get this out of the way quickly, had no interest in doing this movie, but after lots of coaxing and a paycheck that was essentially a bribe, she agreed. You can feel a sort of lack of care in her performance, and it's not because she's a bad actor. Of course, she is absolutely incredible. It's because she didn't want to be in the movie and was given absolute shit to work with. The way Chris's character is handled in this movie is flat out insulting, not just to her character in the original, but honestly the entire plotline of that movie. All right, let's see how this goes. I'm not someone who's at all against having political messaging in film. I hate the word woke. It's usually a cheap buzzword used as a thin veil for shitty opinions, and even when it's not used like that, I think the word's been ruined by it being used that way by way too many people. If you have an issue with how something presents its political or social messaging, explain why you do. Don't just call it woke and move on. I'm also not oblivious to the fact that a lot of media has ridiculous virtue signaling bullshit to try and appeal to the most intense side of a volatile social climate. Sometimes the stuff feels way too forced, but sometimes the criticisms towards things people call woke, like The Last of Us Part 2, is just a way to have another word for being hateful. Oh, it's getting hot in here. The Exorcist Believer has what I think might be the most disrespectful, out of touch, blatantly virtue signaling line I have heard in a horror movie. Here it is.
I didn't actually witness it, you know. My opinion, it's because I'm not a member of the damn patriarchy.
There's a lot to unpack here. She wasn't in the room because she's not a goddamn exorcist and she had no idea what the hell was even going on. The two men in the room that night literally gave their lives to save her daughter, and to have Believer try to take this pseudo-progressive approach by just completely throwing away the gravity of what happened during Reagan's possession and the immense sacrifice Father Merrin and Father Karras made is flat out insulting to the themes of that original movie. She wasn't in the room because the two people who were died fighting the demon they were in there with. That's why. Even on rewatch, I just couldn't believe that I actually heard these words come out of my speakers, because it's so wildly empty and vapid and forced and out of place and disrespectful to the original movie. This is the worst of this kind of thing. Chris's character as a whole is by far the worst thing about The Exorcist Believer. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, Sally was just shoved in there to try and capitalize on Halloween 2018's success. Her character was thin as wax paper and completely unnecessary, but it's even worse here because while Sally isn't an iconic or complex character, Chris McNeil absolutely is, and to see her reduced to this shallow husk forced into a story and handled in such a blatantly disrespectful way is really frustrating. Victor visits her at her beach house where she explains that Reagan cut contact with her after Chris wrote a book about what happened and Reagan felt betrayed, which seems like another forced checkmark on the requel checklist. They make sure you know damn well that Chris isn't an exorcist. It's emphasized over and over again, and then they have her try and conduct an exorcism on Catherine. What the fuck? What are we doing here? It feels so wrong to see Chris McNeil spouting Bible scripture, and the movie mercifully ends her involvement for all intents and purposes when Catherine stabs her eyes out with a crucifix, not before trying to make her some fucking clairvoyant who's able to feel the girls when the exorcism is going on later. For the life of me, I have no idea what the thought process was behind the handling of Chris McNeil's return to this story. The only redeemable thing about this is that we get to see Ellen Burstyn again, and that's always great. The only other thing, was the build up to the moment we meet her actually had some great gravitas to it, with this genuinely great update to Tubular Bells.
To the Zoroastrian text, there are even some incantations for exorcism in the dead.
They did do a strange Uncanny Valley de-aging of Chris for the interview clips, which is really weird, but I will say the music here is fantastic and got me really amped up. Just sucks that how it all plays out is atrocious. The other thing Believer tries to do is implement other religions into the story in an attempt to thematically represent the different cultures of the world with their different life experiences coming together to fight a common enemy. I thought it was an interesting idea when the trailers came out, but the execution basically boils down to, we're in this together, gang, and it really doesn't work.
You've got to bring everyone together. That's what will make this work.
There's no nuance to this stuff at all, and as with Halloween Ends massively struggling to try and stuff too many ideas into its runtime, Believer feels incredibly overstuffed and messy, but also void and empty, since trying to do so many things at once means none of the individual themes get enough attention to feel properly developed. The climax is also really messy, with all of these characters coming together who got so little screen time that they feel like complete strangers who you just don't give a shit about at all. It seems like everything in this movie was meant to fall in place here and form one strong unit, but it's an absolute mess, only somewhat saved by the stellar performances from the two possessed girls. They are genuinely upsetting and heartbreaking, and I will say, there are hints of this chaotic, dark, hopeless tone that I think this ending was going for. You could see glimpses of it being properly impactful. It'll work for a moment, and I'll be feeling that dark and unsettling vibe that I think was the point of all of this, and then it'll get broken by some corny line thrown out by a nothing character or some really bad CGI. Chris Nelson and his team created this absolutely badass design for the demon, and it was meant to be used a lot more, and well, I don't think it would have helped to make this feel more like a proper Exorcist movie. It would have made it at least stand out a bit more. It's a bit of a disservice that this didn't get more screen time considering all the work that was poured in, so huge props to them for putting this together. It's here where that theme of choice comes back into play, with the demon or demons revealing that only one girl can survive, and it's up to the ones here to make the decision.
One girl lives, one girl dies.
At first, they all agree that they won't choose, but Catherine's father eventually breaks down.
I choose you, Catherine!
It's then revealed that Victor actually chose to save his wife back in Haiti, but it didn't work out and Angela was saved instead. I like the idea here. I'm into the concept, and I really wish the story and characters had gotten more room to grow so that this could feel as impactful as it should. I thought this was genuinely cool and presented some interesting moral questions, and it was the main reason that I said in that first review that I was curious to see where things would go in Deceiver. Turns out though, the demon was doing a little wordplay. It never specified that they were choosing which girl would live, and Catherine is taken to hell in a sequence with a visual representation that I actually really dig. This kind of visual is something I do like about the movie, but it's nothing that saves it from being the mess that it is. The movie ends with a ridiculously cheesy monologue from Ann Dowd about the nature of evil, and considering how Green said he was done with Halloween and ready to move on, this feels like he still just wanted to be doing the exact same thing he was with those movies.
That we're born in this world with hope and dreams and a desire to be happy.
This has no place in The Exorcist. It's just jarring. The characters have some brief wrap-ups, none of which matters because none of the characters matter, and before we roll credits, there's a brief scene of Chris in the hospital being visited by Reagan! I do really like that most people on set did not know that Linda Blair was going to be there, and Chris's reaction here is actually Ellen Burstyn seeing Linda for the first time in a long while, so it feels genuine. This is the kind of thing that makes me like Green as a filmmaker, even if I don't always like his creative choices, because it's these little emotional touches that he adds into things that I find does add on to it. He's passionate, and this move in particular really shows that. Not that the scene itself was all that great, it feels really tacked on, but I guess it's still somewhat cool to see them together on screen for the first time since 1973. So, there's some stuff in the first act that I genuinely like. I think there's some good tension, a cool visual style that gave a bit of a unique flair to certain moments, and I like the performances from Leslie Odom Jr. and the two possessed girls. The music is really solid, and some of the ideas the movie tries to explore are conceptually compelling. At times, the movie does get across a tone that I really like and is the main thing that I think will bring me back to watch this on occasion, but when I start thinking about Chris's character and how much of a mess the movie gets after that first act, that is enough to keep me away for a while. I still even with all these issues, don't hate this movie. I do think it's an underdeveloped mess of ideas thrown at the wall hoping something will stick. But the tone of that first act, the great performances from the possessed girls, and some of the visuals that, well, don't fit The Exorcist, I still like them in a vacuum, and those things are enough for me to say I'll probably watch it again at some point. I don't mind a generic possession movie every once in a while, and I can just go make a cup of tea during the 15 minutes Chris is in the movie for. Sometimes the vision comes through for this movie, but overall, it's a mess. And I'm not surprised that its sequel is getting shelved and probably completely retooled. I'm not sure if David Gordon Green wants to keep working in horror because he hasn't exactly been met with open arms, and I couldn't really blame the dude. I still think he shows a lot of promise as a filmmaker, and I really love his passion for the craft. And if he does decide to return to the genre, what I really want to see is for him to do an original IP where he's not constrained by pre-established characters or structure. I want to see what he has to offer with his own fresh creation, but it also wouldn't surprise me to see him just focus on other things, at least for a while. Even me, as an avid Halloween Ends defender, found myself reevaluating elements of that trilogy after seeing how much of a train wreck Believer is. I still love those movies, but this just isn't it. And yet I still bought the 4K Steelbook, didn't I? I don't know what to say. Well, I hope that clears up my stance on The Exorcist Believer, and with this video, I have now done in-depth reviews for every entry in the franchise, so that means we're done with The Exorcist for now. I don't think we'll be seeing that sequel anytime soon, but it's coming, and when it does, I'll be sure to give my thoughts on it, but until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.